The reading is from the book of Genesis, chapter 21, verses 14 through 21. I know it says in the program now 14 through 19, but Janice sent me 14 through 21, so that's what I worked on. So anyway, here we go. So, Abraham rose up early in the morning, and he took bread, and he took a skin of water, and he gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and he sent her away. And she departed, and she wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And when the skin ran out of water, she cast the child under one of the bushes, and she went away. And she sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. And she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice, and she wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, saying, "What troubles you, Hagar? Don't be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and take him by your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she filled the skin with water, and she gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy. He grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him out of the land of Egypt. The word of the Lord.
Good morning, Metro. And yes, it is shadow. I did take a little bit of a liberty with Amanda Gorman's poem, and we talked about shadows and light last week, and this is part 2 today. When we were last together, we were kneeling with exuberant joy in the presence of the holy toddler. Remember, by the time the sages got to Jesus, he was about 2 years old, which is why, if you read the story, Herod sends out all of his people to look for a child 2 years old and younger. So again, our nativity scenes are kind of off, and that's why we go until Three Kings Day, which was Monday, actually. Right. And I feel like we left feeling solidarity with the sages last week who resisted falling under Herod's shadow. They resisted. They didn't go back. And it says that they had a dream that told them to leave in a different direction. And we know that anytime you encounter Jesus, as I said last week, you leave differently. You have a different perspective of yourself and of other people. So the sages left with a different perspective, went back to their own country, but in a different way. So today we're still looking at the same theme, but today it's a different mother, a different child, but still the shadow is looming over them. So I grew up in a home led by a single mother who dedicated her entire life to work on behalf of others. In fact, the majority of the time that she spent as a social worker, she graduated from Mercy or Fordham, she'll probably drop it in the chat because she's online, at the same time that I graduated high school. So I had the privilege of watching my mother just reach for another goal in education. So she worked at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. She was one of the first directors of the family violence program there. I went to church surrounded by powerful women leaders. We had a pastor And we had the church women also. The first woman ordained in the Central Hudson Baptist Association, which is the association that my church belonged to, was the associate minister at my church. I have been in places where people have said to me, I've never seen a woman preacher before. I've never seen a black woman preacher before. And I thought, how horrible for you, but how wonderful that you get to see one now. But with all of this energy, I never paid much attention to Hagar, and I never heard much about her either. In retrospect, I realized that I had been sitting under teachings for decades that placed Hagar's life as a plot device to move along the story of Abram and Sarai, who became Abraham and Sarah. I didn't really meet Hagar until I read Sisters in the Wilderness, The Challenge of Womanist God Talk by Dolores Williams. And she talks about the life of Hagar. She talks about surrogacy of black women. She talks about all the things that we as black women see in Hagar, but we rarely hear preached about or talked about. So we're going to talk about Hagar today. But I will say the preaching moment doesn't give me all the time I would want to talk about Hagar in the way she deserves, because in her life there are important lessons for all of us. So let us consider what the life of a single young mother from Egypt, who is the mother of a teenage boy, matter. Let us consider how her life matters. The text you heard begins, "So Abraham rose early in the morning." And I know that anytime I hear so is the same as therefore. The therefore is there to remind us that something came before the therefore. We meet Hagar today in chapter 21, but let's go back to 16 and meet her again for the first time. So Abram and Sarai were married, and Hagar was Sarai's servant. Abram and Sarai are a couple who are unable to conceive, and feeling the need to help God along with the process, Sarai tells Abram to take my slave, Hagar. Then Hagar becomes pregnant, and there is tension in the Abram's household. Tension between Sarai and Abram, tension between Sarai and Hagar. Hagar is treated horribly, I would say violently, to the degree that she runs away. And I want to read from verse 7. "The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And the angel said, 'Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?' And Hagar says, 'I am running away from my mistress Sarai.' The angel of the Lord said to her, 'Return to your mistress and submit to her.' The angel also said to her, 'I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude.'" These are almost the same exact words that Abram heard. "So she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. She said, 'You are the God who sees me.' For she said to herself, 'I have seen the one who sees me. I have seen the one who sees me.'" In fact, Hagar is the first and I think the only person in the Bible to give a name to the deity. This young Egyptian girl gives a name to the deity, the one who sees. So by the time we catch up to where we are in 21, Abram and Sarai have name changes, and now they're known as Abraham and Sarah. Sodom and Gomorrah has happened. Sarah has stood at the entrance of the tent when the messengers came to talk to Abraham about the promise, and she laughed at the idea. She says, "Will I know this thing of giving birth?" Will Gaffney, our favorite professor, Will Gaffney says that Sarah actually says, "Will I know pleasure again?" We're old. Are we going to know this thing that everyone else gets to know? This is what, and she laughs because to her the idea is absurd. Absurd. By the time we get to where we are today in chapter 21, the baby has been born, And Ishmael, according to Dolores Williams' notes in her book, Sisters in the Wilderness, that scholars say Ishmael is about 16 years old at this point. So a lot of time has passed. Hagar and Ishmael are part of a long history of mothers and children who have been made vulnerable in ways beyond their power to avoid. When we talk about people who are vulnerable, I don't know that we always ask, well, what made them vulnerable? Did they just wake up one day and say, I'm vulnerable? How did that happen? No, there are systems in place. They have been underserved while others have been overserved. They've been shoved to the margins of their society, to the wilderness, while others live at ease in the center. They're on the bus and the subway on their way to countless appointments where they can try to dip their cups into the shallow well of resources that are supposed to be dedicated to helping them. And this is why we say defund the police. Put a little bit more money in the resources that would support a Hagar and Ishmael. This is being recorded, right? They are hustling to appointments with social workers and case managers, ACS. Safe Horizons and sanctuaries for families in the city have multiple shelters, and their shelters are full of Hagars and Ishmaels. They swipe their Eat Better Today cards right in front of us in the supermarket, hoping that the limited resources will last and that their children will think it's fun to have breakfast for dinner. They're meeting with some judgmental school administrators, and some are raising their children from behind prison bars. I've met some of those women, but they also love their children fiercely and would do anything to protect their children from harm, to protect their children from getting caught up in the grind of systems that are either working, I don't know, are the systems working to perfection? Or are they broken? But the brokenness, yeah, see, is the brokenness the perfection of how the systems were created to work? I don't know. But I know that there are Hagars out there who are working to protect their children from being ground up in those systems. I have seen my own mother working to protect me and my sisters from being ground up, from being overtaken and overwhelmed by that shadow as a single mother. And breakfast for dinner is fun. And I never knew that we were poor because my mother's smile guaranteed that we didn't know what was going on until now. I knew that was going to happen. It's my glucose monitor. I remember during a previous administration how there were some people who were watching the waves of unaccompanied minors come across the southern border, and they criticized parents who sent them unaccompanied. And I think it's ironic because those parents didn't really have a choice. I mean, and think about it, it's kind of ironic that they were sending their children across the border for a better and safer life in the country that actually set up the environment that created unsafe situations in their own country. We had no right to criticize them. We should have been swinging open the doors to welcome them because it was our fault. But those parents said, as Hagar said, let me not see the death of my child. After all Hagar and her son had been through, and there's more. Read the story. There's more. The messenger of God calls to Hagar from the heavens after she has been put out. Remember, the first time she left, and this time Abraham sends her out. God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Interesting, because Ishmael means God will hear. Abraham named him Ishmael, God will hear. And then Hagar gets the assurance and the confirmation that yes, God will hear. God is hearing your cry. He's hearing your cry on the supermarket line. He's hearing your cry as you're sitting in those meetings. He's hearing your cry, Hagar, as you're trying to make it to an appointment on the bus or the subway, or trying to drive in and pay congestion prices that no one can really afford. God hears your cry. The God who has seen you still sees you. I want to leave you with this last thought. Will Gaffney says that there is one distinct angel among the host of heaven, the angel of God, or the Lord, she says. And in the 17th verse, in translators, there's always these translations behind the scenes. This is known as the angel of wisdom. And she says that many scholars understand this angel to be God in disguise. God disguised. So that God can be among her people without holiness harming them. Because remember, we can't be up close to God's holiness. So when Hagar is encountering, she's encountering what Will Gaffney says is God in drag. However God shows up. However, and I know God is ever present, and it sounds quaint and a little uneducated to say God shows up. However, I have been in this sanctuary and experienced such a palpable presence of God. The only way that I can explain it is that God shows up. Here, for Hagar, and for all the Hagars and the Ishmaels, let us consider the life of this young single mother and her teenage son, and consider how we can be, dare I say, God in drag, attempting to shine a light in the never-ending shadow that is looming over them. Let us consider. Amen.